Good afternoon, Audi S3 Fanatics. It's Peter, your Audi S3 Fanatic. I welcome you as well as MQB chassis owners to my channel. And what we will do is we will be working on the MQB suspension today, specifically installing springs or coils, or in general, just removing your suspension to do some servicing. Now, my client was kind enough to kind of leave his car here for me to do some reverting back to stock. He currently has mag ride on his S3 with the MSS kit, and I am going to be removing it and returning it back to stock for him. Although that isn't necessarily working with coils per se, I will go through the entire process of removing the suspension for you guys to see, and it is completely applicable to you installing springs or coilovers. The first thing, we'll go ahead and install the rear suspension, since that is typically the easier of the front and rear. Then I'll go ahead and remove the front suspension, and kind of in between I will show you, or at least teach you, what you need to do to adjust your coilovers to kind of match the height that you want. Now, before you proceed, I do recommend that you get the vehicle up as high as you can. If you have quick jacks, that's a fantastic thing. If you have access to a lift, even better. You can do it on jack stands. It's a little more challenging to do because you just don't have the height to get that done. But again, it is totally doable. And the last thing that I recommend that you guys do, and I can put this in the channel for you to download if you like, but I put together kind of a spec sheet on the torque settings that you want to use for the car. I may be off 1 or 2 pounds, but it is very close to what the manufacturer recommends. And what this really serves is a safety net. I will be the first to admit that with the tons of suspension work that I have done in the past, I have forgotten to torque something down, but I end up catching myself and doing it later. And then by me putting together this sheet here, I've got a yes and a no for the torquing of the specific bolt, so it keeps me on track. And I highly recommend that you guys do something like that as well, because the last thing you want to do, get everything down, you do a test drive and you've got things clunking because you didn't torque something down. Without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Alright guys, so this is going to be your rear suspension's nomenclature, and I am choosing to do the passenger side as a demonstration because this one is the more complicated of the two sides, and I'll show you in just a little bit. But let's go ahead and just talk about some bolts that you have to remove. This here is going to be your end link bolt you need to remove. And if you can kind of see where my pointer is, this is going to be your leveling sensor that you also have to disconnect. Moving on over to the shock bolt here, and then you have your knuckle bolt that you're going to have to remove. So under this portion, there's a total of 1, 2, 3, 4. When you do remove this, I would recommend that you have a jack underneath, because the spring is going to be under a fair amount of tension and you don't want it to snap on down from you. And it just allows you to kind of move this up and down a little bit so that you can align the bolts to come on out. This is going to be the shock that you need to remove if you are actually swapping out your shocks. You'll remove this here, you'll remove this here, 2 of the bolts that's holding in an looks like a canister, and then you're going to remove both of these, which will allow you to drop the shock bolt down. I'm sorry, not the shock bolt, but the shock itself. So that is the steps you need to take if you are replacing the shock as well. If you are just installing an MSS kit or a spring kit, you do not need to remove this. All right, so we've got essentially all the bolts that needed to be removed off. From here, I'll get out underneath the vehicle. We'll put a jack up here, and we are going to essentially tap both of these out, as well as this one here, so that the arm can actually drop on down. But make sure you've got a jack to support the tension of the spring. Okay, so this control arm is going to be under some tension. I did want to point out something very important to you guys. These bolts, as you can see, are completely different lengths. You don't want to mix them around. The long one is going to be for your shock, and the short one is going to be for the knuckles. So make sure that you do that correctly. And we'll go ahead and lower this perch down here. Now with guys that are doing coilovers, with this out of the way, you'll go ahead and remove the shock with the 2 bolts on top, and then the shock will just come on down. We'll go ahead and reinstall the spring at this point. Now I wanted to show you the control arm, and let's kind of move this up just a little bit here. This is where your spring is going to sit, and if you take a look here, there is a little notch on the rubber piece that your spring has to sit into, whether you're installing springs or coilovers. But we'll move over to the spring here. Here is the end of the spring that I'm referring to that actually has to sit in that notch. You'll turn the spring until it stops, then you know you have properly seated the spring. It took some force to get this spring in because it's a very tight fit with the OEM rubber bushing, but you got to push until the spring seats in there, and then make sure that the end of the spring hits that notch. We'll go ahead and put the OEM top on here, kind of press it in, and then from here you align it with this little nipple here. Put the jack underneath, and we're going to go ahead and jack it up. At that point, I would recommend that you put one of the bolts in to secure the tension, so that you can go ahead and install the end link bolt, and then go ahead and install either the knuckle or the shock bolt on. When installing these bolts here, you're going to run into a little challenge where it's not properly going to align. But as you can tell, it's completely off here. And what you have to essentially do is get a little screwdriver and move it around until it lines up. And then I just am going to drive this through once I'm able to line it up and to hold the control arm or the knuckle here, just like such. All right, guys, so we have the rear suspension completely put back together, minus the leveling. I just wanted to kind of go over torque specs with you guys here, using my little sheet that I put together. Now, this here, again, is the N link, and I have it listed at 26 foot-pounds of torque. This is going to be your shock bolt, and let's take a look here. This one is 133, and then this here is your knuckle, which I have listed at 66. And for the end link, there's really no torque spec. You just want to go ahead and make it nice and snug. Now we're going to go ahead and move over to the shock. If in the event that you guys did remove it, there are 2 shock to chassis that you need to remove, and I have those listed at 35 foot-pounds. Now the torque spec for the rear top hat is only at 25 foot-pounds. Now it is very crucial, you want to be around that or slightly above it, because if you are well below that, you're going to have some play in here and you're going to hear a lot of rattle, and that typically is a sure sign that you did not torque down the top hat. With this section here of the video, I wanted to talk to you guys about how to properly adjust your coilover setup. Now I will use the MSS kit as an example, but it will work with any coilover you guys have. My suggestion is to always start on the high side, so that way you can lower the car a little easier, because if you set the coilover too low and you try to raise it, I can guarantee you it's going to be a whole lot more challenging of a job because you're fighting the weight of the vehicle. So start a little higher and then it's a little easier to lower. So put the tire back on the car, use a jack underneath the tire and start lifting that suspension up. So what's going to happen is you're going to get it to a point, the suspension itself, it starts to raise, and then the car actually starts to raise. That's when you know that you have kind of hit that peak height of your coilover adjustment. So let's just say you've reached that point where now you're starting to lift one of the ends of the vehicle up. You'll measure the distance from the tire to your fender, and let's say it's 1 inch. And you want to have like a 1 finger gap, and using, it's just an example, you want to lower it an additional ½ inch. From there, go ahead and lower that rear end or that tire back down, and then from there you'll go ahead and adjust the coilover to the appropriate height. Now you can do that once again, and then this time you should see that the tire will actually start to be a little higher. So once it reaches that height that you think that is good for you, bring it back down. You'll go ahead and measure the distance that you may have from the perch to the end of the coilover top, and then from there you'll take that same measurement and bring it over to the other side, so that way you have essentially come as close as possible to the ride height that you want. You can do that for the rear and also from the front. It's a little unconventional to do it that way, but I have put enough coilovers and adjusted enough to know that it is just not an easy process to do. Let's go ahead and discuss the removal of the front suspension now. What you'll see here is this is the cover that houses the top of the shock. You've got a weather stripping that runs from here all the way to the other side. I have actually removed it already, and then that allows you to pull this back. You'll want to go ahead and remove this little foam piece here, because it will allow you to remove this here. That allows you to remove the 3 top chassis bolt to the shock bolts that you need to remove. So we'll do that. Let's go ahead and move down to the suspension in itself. Alright, so here is the front suspension. You need to remove the end link bolt here that holds your end link. Bring it right over toward the rear of the vehicle. You'll see that this here is going to be the bolt that holds the knuckle onto the shock. And then below here, you'll see 3 bolts that you'll need to remove to pull this out here. For guys that have the mag ride, here is the connection to the damper itself that you want to disconnect. Now, while you're at it, to make things a little easier to allow you to have more room to move, I would recommend that you pull off some of this here, as well as this unit right here. And I don't think we need to remove this, but what that does is it allows you to pull the whole shock assembly out without putting a lot of strain on these hoses here. Now, for guys that have the A3 chassis, your shock is going to be a little taller. And unfortunately, what you need to do is you need to remove the axle bolt here. And what that does is it allows you to pull this whole unit out and drop it a little further so that you can actually get this shock out. Let's go ahead and start disassembling the front suspension. Now that we have the lower bolts off, we're going to go ahead and remove these here. However, you do need a couple of specialized bits. This one is going to be 18, and this here is actually a triple square, and it's going to be a triple square number 6. This is 18. Coming over here to remove this one, it's a 14, so you can see it's a very specialized tool that goes right in here. I wanted to show you guys the next portion of the front suspension install. This control arm, or whatever you want to call it, as you can tell, I had to free it from these 3 bolts here, and I just wedged something in there to kind of keep it down, and I have removed all of the other screws. Now, at this point, you are going to need your strut spreader, and we'll go ahead and kind of pan it up. Here is the bottom of the shock. You've got the knuckle that holds it in, and you have to have a device that's called a strut spreader. This one's a little more elaborate, but you can buy them for about $10 that actually go in here, and you'll turn it 90 degrees and it spreads out this knuckle. The only problem with those type of spreaders is because this is aluminum, when this owner had theirs installed, it actually damaged some of the aluminum here, and I couldn't get a very good grasp on it to spread it. So I bought something that's much more elaborate, that doesn't damage it as bad. And from there, I turned it. It forces this thing in and opens it up so that I can have access to pull this out. So we'll go ahead and loosen this and pull this part of the assembly down, this shock up, to completely remove it from the housing here. Okay, so we have the suspension removed, and I just wanted to kind of show you guys real quick. Here is the strut spreader that opens this up, and here's kind of the end result with the shock out. It's best if you have 2 people, one that actually can hold this while you undo the screws up on top, and then just kind of move it and shake it and shimmy it around until it completely comes out. Again, with the A3 chassis, with the higher or taller shocks, you do have to remove the axle bolt so that this whole assembly can come out, to allow you to drop this just a tad bit lower so that you can get the shock out. I know it's not ideal, but that is going to be the way to do it for the taller shocks. So now we'll go ahead and start removing the top hat off of this assembly here and put the original one back on. Now that we have the MSS kit off of the shock, we are replacing it with the original. You can tell I've got a couple of coil compressors here, or spring compressors. If you take a look here, this is kind of the bottom housing, and the spring will sit right in here. Now, with the top hat, you've got this unit here as well as the top hat itself. They go together just like this with the edge, and just like that. Now this here, when you are aligning it to the top, you need to make sure these right here align up to this here. So if you were to draw a straight line, it will go right over here. So we'll go ahead and put this together, and I'll show you the final assembly of what the shock should look like. Those of you who are installing coilovers, it's going to be the same process where you are actually putting the coilover spring on here. You will most likely end up using the stock top hat, and it will essentially go onto the sleeve, or I should say the perch that actually goes up and down on the coilover itself. So it'll be the spring, you've got kind of the perch, and then the top hat right here that will go on in. All right, so we have everything put together for the front shock, and I made sure to align these lines here to the bottom of the shock. Now I wanted to leave this just like this for you guys to see how to properly torque the top hat down. You've got kind of like a passover socket that is specific to this here. You've got an Allen that which holds it, and my torque wrench. So you want to go ahead and torque it just like that. I don't typically recommend impact wrenches, but in the case that you don't have something like this, you do want to make sure that it is snug. The torque spec for the stock OEM unit is 44 foot-pounds of torque. So go ahead and do that. We'll do this here, and then I'll get it back up and inside the vehicle. Alright, so we have everything all tidied up here, but I did want to give you guys some torque specs. Here is going to be your sway bar end link, which you want to torque down to 48 foot-pounds of torque. This here is going to be your pinch bolt, and you want to do that to 52 foot-pounds. Now below, we had 3 of the knuckle ball nuts, and you want to torque those down to 35 foot-pounds. And for you guys who actually removed the axle bolt, you want to go ahead and torque that down to 125 foot-pounds. Now if you missed, up on top there are 3 shock to chassis bolts. Those are going to be 11 to 12 foot-pounds. And then again, the shock top hat itself is 44 foot-pounds of torque. So we are done at this point. What we'll go ahead and do is wrap it up with the other side, slap on the wheels, and we are done. All right, so now that we have the suspension completed on the S3 or MQB chassis, I wanted to go ahead and just run over some final comments with you guys regarding the installation. Again, I do highly recommend that, for one, you've got the vehicle up as relatively high as you can. You do need to have some specialized tools to help you remove some of that bolt. And if you have access to air tools, that is going to be a huge plus, because it will help you remove the top hats off of the shock itself. Now, some of the torque specs that I shared with you guys have a certain caveat, and what I mean by that is, if you want to do everything by the Audi manual, after their torque specs, they are going to tell you to do a 45-degree turn or a 90-degree turn with your torque wrench. And the reason why they tell you that is a majority of bolts that Audi uses for the suspension, it's going to be what is called a torque to yield bolt, and ideally they only want you to use that one time. Now, with all of the suspension that I have installed on my vehicles as well as client vehicles, I have never replaced these bolts at all. But knock on wood, I've never also had a bolt snap on me. However, I have read in some rare instances and cases where users have actually snapped the bolts off because the bolt was torqued to the point where it yielded and then it would snap at that point. So it's really up to you guys. If you want to do everything by the book, you can definitely do it that way. But again, with my experience, I have never replaced any of the bolts or snapped anything off. Knock on wood, I don't have any future issues. This section that I had discussed with you guys about the adjustment of coilovers, I hope I didn't confuse you too much. The main thing that I really wanted to point out is adjustment of coils is not going to be a fun and easy process. For one, you have to essentially guess where your coilover is going to be set at correctly, and then from there you've got to raise or lower the vehicle in accordance to get the height that you want. So the technique that I shared with you ideally will have you set up at the proper height to what you desire, and you want to do it on one side and then kind of match it to the other side, so that way you're not going up and down and trying to pull things back and forth and trying to wrench in that tight spot with those spanner wrenches, because it is definitely not fun. I will in the future have a video specifically dedicated on that specific technique on how to properly adjust it, but we're probably looking at a few weeks out. But I'll definitely get something out there for you guys to help coilover users be able to adjust their coils much easier. In closing, I, as usual, always want to thank all of you for watching my videos and supporting my channel. It has been such a great process to do all this stuff for you guys, and I look forward to the very next DIY for you.